In the old days, they sent out calendars for the new year and skipped Christmas, but I figure they are now responsible for about a fifth of the deluge. Still another category includes inns, bars, restaurants, institutions, councils, committees, leagues, and other organizations. One of my own 1956 cards came from the art department of Immaculate Heart College in Los Angeles, whose point of contact with me has eluded my memory. A certain detective agency used to send me a laconic word every December, but last year, for some disturbing reason, I was struck off the agency's list. I don't know how I got on it in the first place, since I have never employed a private investigator to shadow anybody, but it may be that I was one of the shadowed. The agency's slogan is, "When we follow him, he stays followed," and its card was invariably addressed to Mr. James Ferber. This hint of alias added a creepy note to the holidays, and curiously enough, the sudden silence has had the same effect. A man who is disturbed when he hears from a detective agency, and when he doesn't, may be put down, I suppose, as a natural phenomenon of our nervous era. I suddenly began wondering, in one of my onsets of panic, what becomes of all these cards. The lady in my house, who adds 200 items to the annual avalanche all by herself, calmed my anxiety by telling me that most of them get burned. Later I found out to my dismay that this is not actually true. There are at least 9 million little girls who consider Christmas cards too beautiful to burn and carefully preserve them. One mother told me that her garage contains 15 large cartons filled with old Christmas cards. This, I am glad to say, is no problem of mine, but there is a major general somewhere who may have to deal with it one of these years if the accumulation becomes a national menace, hampering the movement of troops. 90% of women employ the annual greeting as a means of fending off a more frequent correspondence. One woman admitted to me that she holds at least a dozen friends at arm's or year's length by turning greeting cards into a kind of annual letter. The most a man will consent to write on a Christmas card is "Hi, boy," or "Keep pitching," but a wife often manages several hundred words. These words, in most instances, have a way of dwindling with the march of the decades until they become highly concentrated and even cryptic, such as, "Will you ever forget that ox-bice cake?" Or, "George says to tell Jim to look out for the 36. Thus, the terrible flux of December mail is made up, in considerable part, of the forgotten and the meaningless. The money spent on all these useless cryptograms would benefit some worthy cause by at least $3 million. The sex behind most of the 1.5 billion Christmas cards is, of course, the female. I should judge that about 75 million cards are received annually by women from former cooks, secretaries, and hairdressers, the formerness of some of them going back as far as 1924. It is not always easy for even the most experienced woman card sender to tell an ex-hairdresser from someone she met on a night of high wind and Bacardi at Cambridge beaches in Bermuda. The late John McNulty once solved this for my own wife by saying, "All hairdressers are named Dolores." The wonderful McNulty's gift of inspired oversimplification, like his many other gifts, is sorely missed by hundreds of us. McNulty and I, both anti-card men, never exchanged Christmas greetings except in person or on the phone. There was a time when I drew my own Christmas cards, but I gave it up for good after 1937. In that year I had drawn what purported to be a little girl, all agape and enchanted in front of a strangely ornamented Christmas tree. The cards were printed in Paris and mailed to me, 200 of them in Italy. We were spending Christmas in Naples. The cards were held up at the border by the Italian authorities, agents of Mussolini, who suspected everything, and returned to Paris. "I should think," commented an English friend of mine, "that 200 copies of any drawing of yours might well give the authorities pause." One couple, to conclude this survey on an eerie note, had sent out the same engraved Christmas card every year. Last time, from John and Joan, had undergone a little change. Joan had crossed out John and. Her friends wonder just how many of these cheery greetings the predeceased Joan has left. So passed one husband with only a pencil stroke to mark his going. Peace on earth, goodwill to women. File and forget. I want to thank my secretary, Miss Ellen Bagley, for putting the following letters in order. I was not up to the task myself, for reasons that will, I think, become clear to the reader. J.T., West Cornwall, Connecticut, November 2nd, 1948. Miss Alma Wynage, The Charteris Publishing Company, 132 East What Street, New York, New York. Dear Miss Wynage, your letter of October 25th, which you sent to me in care of the Homestead, Hot Springs, Arkansas, has been forwarded to my home in West Cornwall, Connecticut by the Homestead, Hot Springs, Virginia. As you know, Mrs. Thurber and I sometimes visit this Virginia resort, but we haven't been there for more than a year. Your company, in the great tradition of publishers, has sent so many letters to me at Hot Springs, Arkansas, that the postmaster there has simply taken to sending them on to the right address, or what would be the right address if I were there. I explained to Mr. Cluffman and also to Miss Lexie, when I last called at your offices, that all mail was to be sent to me at West Cornwall until further notice. If and when I go to the homestead, I will let you know in advance. Meanwhile, I suggest that you remove from your files all addresses of mine except the West Cornwall one. Another publishing firm recently sent a letter to me at 65 West 11th Street, an address I vacated in the summer of 1930. It would not come as a surprise to me if your firm or some other publishers wrote me in care of my mother at 568 Oak Street, Columbus, Ohio. I was 13 years old when we lived there back in 1908. As for the contents of your letter of the 25th, I did not order 36 copies of Peggy Peckham's book, Grandma Was a Nudist. I trust that you have not shipped these books to me in care of the Homestead, Hot Springs, Arkansas, or anywhere else. Sincerely yours, J. Thurber. P.S. Margaret Peckham, by the way, is not the author of this book. She is the distinguished New York psychiatrist whose The Implications of Nudism was published a couple of years ago. She never calls herself Peggy. J.T., West Cornwall, Connecticut, November 3rd, 1948. Miss Alma Wynage, The Charteris Publishing Company, 132 East What Street, New York, New York. Dear Miss Wynage, in this morning's mail I received a card from the Grand Central Branch of the New York Post Office, informing me that a package of books had been delivered to me at 410 East 57th Street. The branch office is holding the package for further postage, which runs to a considerable amount. I am enclosing the notification card, since these must be the 36 copies of Grandma Was a Nudist. I have not lived at 410 East 57th Street since the fall of 1944. Please see to it that this address is removed from your files along with the homestead address. Whoever ordered those books, if anyone actually did, probably wonders where they are. Sincerely yours, J. Thurber. The Charteris Publishing Company, New York, New York, November 5th, 1948. Mr. James M. Thurber, West Cornwall, Connecticut. Dear Mr. Thurber, I am dreadfully sorry about the mix-up over Miss Peckham's book. We have been pretty much upset around here since the departure of Mr. Peterson and Mr. West, and several new girls came to us with the advent of Mr. Jordan. They have not yet got their sea legs, I am afraid. But I still cannot understand from what file our shipping department got your address as 165 West 11th Street. I have removed the 57th Street address from the files, and also the Arkansas address, and I trust that we will not disturb your tranquility further up there in Cornwall. It must be lovely this time of year in Virginia, and I envy you and Mrs. Thurber. Have a lovely time at the homestead. Sincerely yours, Alma Wynage. P.S. What you had to say about Grandma amused us all. A.W. Columbus, Ohio, November 16th, 1948. Dear Mr. Thurber, I have decided to come right out with the little problem that was accidentally dumped in my lap yesterday. I hope you will forgive me for what happened, and perhaps you can suggest what I should do with the books. There are 36 of them, and unfortunately they arrived when my little son Donald was alone downstairs. By the time I found out about the books, he had torn all the wrappings and had built a cute little house out of them. I have placed them all on a shelf out of his reach while awaiting word as to where to send them. I presume I could ship them to you COD if I can get somebody to wrap them properly. I heard from old Mrs. Winston next door that you and your family once lived here at 568 Oak Street. She remembers you and your brothers as cute little tykes who were very noisy and raised rabbits and guinea pigs. She says your mother was a wonderful cook. I am sorry about Donald opening the books, and I hope you will forgive him. Sincerely yours, Clara Edwards, Mrs. J.C. West Cornwall, Connecticut, November 19th, 1948. Mr. Leon Charteris, the Charteris Publishing Company, 132 East Watt Street, New York, New York. Dear Mr. Charteris, I am enclosing a letter from a Mrs. J.C. Edwards of Columbus, Ohio, in the fervent hope that you will do something to stop this insane flux of books. I never ordered these books. I have not read Grandma Was a Nudist. I do not intend to read it. I want something done to get these volumes off my trail and cut out of my consciousness. I have written Miss Wynage about the situation, but I am afraid to take it up with her again, because she might send them to me in care of the Department of Journalism at Ohio State University, where I was a student more than 30 years ago. Sincerely yours, J. Thurber. P.S. I never use my middle initial, but your firm seems to think it is M. It is not. J.T. The Charteris Publishing Company, New York, New York, November 23rd, 1948. Mr. James M. Thurber, West Cornwall, Connecticut. Dear Mr. Thurber, Mr. Charteris has flown to California on a business trip and will be gone for several weeks. His secretary has turned your letter of the 19th over to me. I have asked Mr. Cloughman to write to Miss Clara Edwards in Columbus and arrange for the reshipment of the 36 copies of Grandma Was a Nudist. I find, in consulting the records, that you have 3 times ordered copies of your own book, Thurber's Ark, to be shipped to you at West Cornwall at the usual discount rate of 40%. I take it that what you really wanted was 36 copies of your own book, and they are being sent out to you today with our regrets for the discomfort we have caused you. I hope you will be a little patient with us during this so trying period of reorganization. Cordially yours, Jeanette Gaines, Stock Order Department. P.S. You will be happy to know that we have traced down the gentleman who ordered those copies of Grandma. West Cornwall, Connecticut, November 25th, 1948. Mr. Henry Johnson, the Charteris Publishing Company, New York, New York. Dear Harry, since the reorganization at Charteris, I have the forlorn and depressing feeling that I no longer know anybody down there except you. I know that this immediate problem of mine is not in your field, but I turn to you as a last resource. What I want, or rather what I don't want, is simple enough, Harry. God knows it is simple. I don't want any more copies of my book. I don't want any more copies of my book. I don't want any more copies of my book. As ever, Jim. P.S. It has just occurred to me that I haven't seen you for more than 2 years. Let's have a drink one of these days. I'll give you a ring the next time I'm in the city. J.T. The Charteris Publishing Company, New York, New York, November 26, 1948. Mr. James Grover Thurber, Cornwall, Connecticut. Dear Jim Thurber, I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you since I had the great good luck to join forces with Charteris, but I look forward to our meeting with a high heart. Please let me know the next time you are in the city, as I should like to wine and dine you, and perhaps discuss the new book that I feel confident you have in you. If you don't want to talk shop, we can discuss the record of our mutual football team. You were at Northwestern some years ahead of my time, I believe, but I want you to know that they still talk about Jimmy Thurber out there. Your letter to Harry Johnson has just come to my attention, and I regret to say that Harry is no longer with us. He went to Harcourt Brace in the summer of 1947. I want you to feel, however, that every single one of us here is your friend, willing and eager to drop everything to do your slightest bidding. All of us feel very deeply about your having turned against your book, Thurber's Ark. I note that in your present mood, you have the feeling that you never want to see it again. Well, Jim, let me assure you that this is just a passing fancy, derived from a moment of depression. When you put in your last order for 36 copies, you must surely have had some definite use in mind for them, and I am banking on 20 years' experience in the book publishing game when I take the liberty of sending these 20 books off to you today. There is one thing I am something of an expert at, if I do say so myself, and that is the understanding of the creative spirit. We have a new system here, which is to send our authors not 10 free copies, as of old, but 15. Therefore, 5 of the 36 copies will reach you with our compliments. The proper deductions will be made on the record. Don't forget our dinner date. Cordially, Clint Jordan. P.S. I approve of your decision to resume the use of your middle name. It gives a book dignity and flavor to use all 3 names. I think it was old Willa Cather who started the new trend when she dropped the Seibert. C.J. The Charteris Publishing Company, New York, New York, December 13th, 1948. Dear Thurber, just back at the old desk after a trip to California and a visit with my mother, who is 89 now, but as chipper as ever. She would make a swell profile. Ask me about her someday. Need I say I was delighted to hear from the staff when I got back about your keen interest in Grandma Was a Nudist. The book has been moving beautifully, and its ceiling has gone sky high. We're planning a brief new advertising campaign, and I'd be tickled pink if you would be good enough to bat out a blurb for us. Yours, Leon. The Charteris Publishing Company, New York, New York, December 15th, 1948. Mr. James M. Thurber, West Cornwall, Connecticut. Dear Mr. Thurber, I hope you will forgive me, indeed all of us, for having inexcusably mislaid the address of the lady to whom the 36 copies of Grandma Was a Nudist were sent by mistake. I understand that we have already dispatched to you at your home another 36 volumes of that book. My apologies again. Sincerely yours, H. F. Cloughman. West Cornwall, Connecticut, December 19th, 1948. Mr. H. F. Cloughman, The Charteris Publishing Company, 132 East Watt Street, New York, New York. Dear Mr. Cloughman, the lady's name is Mrs. J.C. Edwards, and she lives at 568 Oak Street, Columbus, Ohio. I have explained as clearly as I could in previous letters that I did not order 36 copies of Grandma Was a Nudist. If you have actually shipped to me another 36 copies of this book, it will make a total of 72 copies, none of which I will pay for. The 36 copies of Thurber's Ark that Mr. Jordan has written me he intends to send to West Cornwall would bring up to 108 the total number of books that your firm, by a conspiracy of confusion unique even in the case of publishers, has mistakenly charged to my account. You may advise Mr. Jordan that I do not wish to receive the 5 free copies he mentioned in his letter. If your entire staff of employees went back to Leslie's Weekly, where they belong, it would set my mind at rest. Sincerely, J. Thurber. P.S. I notice that you use only my middle initial M. Mr. Jordan and I, or was it Mr. Charteris, have decided to resume the use of the full name, which is Murfreesboro. J.T. West Cornwall, Connecticut, December 27th, 1948. Mr. Leon Charteris, The Charteris Publishing Company, 132 East Watt Street, New York, New York. Dear Mr. Charteris, I am sure you will be sorry to learn that Mr. Thurber has had one of his spells as a result of the multiplication of books and the misunderstanding that began with Miss Alma Wynage's letter of October 25th, 1948. Those of us around Mr. Thurber are greatly disturbed by the unfortunate circumstances that have caused him to give up writing, at least temporarily, just after he had resumed work following a long fallow period. 36 copies of Mr. Thurber's book and 36 copies of Grandma Was a Nudist have arrived at his home here, and he has asked me to advise you that he intends to burn all 72. West Cornwall is scarcely the community for such a demonstration. He proposes to burn them in the middle of U.S. Highway number 7, since the town regards with a certain suspicion any writer who has not won a Pulitzer Prize. I am enclosing copies of all the correspondence between your company and Mr. Thurber in the hope that someone connected with your firm will read it with proper care and intelligence and straighten out this deplorable and inexcusable situation. Mr. Thurber wishes me to tell you that he does not want to hear from any of you again. Sincerely yours, Ellen Bagby, Secretary to Mr. Thurber. The Charteris Publishing Company, New York, New York, December 28, 1948. Mr. James Murfreesboro Thurber, 72 West, Cornwall, Connecticut. Dear Mr. Thurber, I have at hand your letter of December 19th, the opening paragraph of which puzzles me. You send me the following name and address, Mrs. J.C. Edwards, 568 Oak Street, Columbus, Ohio, but it is not clear what use you wish me to make of this. I would greatly appreciate it if you would clear up this small matter for me. Sincerely yours, H.F. Cloughman. P.S. Leslie's Weekly ceased publication many years ago. I could obtain the exact date if you so desire. H.F.C. The Charteris Publishing Company, New York, New York, December 29, 1948. Mr. James M. Thurber, West Cornwall, Connecticut. Dear Mr. Thurber, you will be sorry to hear that Mr. Charteris was taken suddenly ill with a virus infection. His doctor believes that he lost his immunity during his visit to the West Coast. He is now in the hospital, but his condition is not serious. Since the departure of Miss Gaines, who was married last week, I have taken over the stock order department for the time being. I did not take the liberty of reading your enclosures in the letter to Mr. Charteris, but sent them directly to him at the hospital. I am sure that he will be greatly cheered up by them when he is well enough to read. Meanwhile, I want you to know that you can repose all confidence in the stock order department to look after your needs, whatever they may be. Sincerely yours, Gladys McLean. P.S. I learned from Mr. Jordan that you were a friend of Willa Cather's. Exciting. Columbus, Ohio, January 3rd, 1949. Dear Jamie, I don't understand the clipping from the Lakeville Journal Helen's mother sent me about someone burning all those books of yours in the street. I never heard of such a thing, and don't understand how they could have taken the books without your knowing it, or what you were doing with so many copies of the novel about the naked grandmother. Imagine at her age. She couldn't carry on like that in Columbus, let me tell you. Why, when I was a girl, you didn't dare walk with a man after sunset unless he was your husband, and even then there was talk. It's a good thing that state policemen came along in time to save most of the books from being completely ruined, and you must be thankful for the note Mr. Jordan put in one of the books, for the policeman would never have known who they belonged to if he hadn't found it. Mrs. Edwards phoned this morning and said that her son Donald collects your books and wants to send them to you to be autographed, I suppose. Her son has dozens of your books, and I told her you simply wouldn't have time to sign all of them. And she said she didn't care what you did with them. And then she said they weren't your books at all, so I just hung up on her. Be sure to bundle up when you go out. With love, Mother. P.S. This Mrs. Edwards says she lives at 568 Oak Street. I told her we used to live there, and she said God knows she was aware of that. I don't know what she meant. I was afraid this little boy would send you all those books to sign, and so I told his mother that you and Helen were at the homestead in Hot Springs. You don't suppose he would send them there, do you? And here, gentle reader, I know you will be glad to leave all of us. A sort of genius. On the morning of Saturday the 16th of September, 1922, A boy named Raymond Schneider and a girl named Pearl Balmer, walking down a lonely lane on the outskirts of New Brunswick, New Jersey, came upon something that made them rush to the nearest house in Easton Avenue, around the corner, shouting. In that house, an excited woman named Grace Edwards listened to them wide-eyed and then telephoned the police. The police came on the run and examined the young people's discovery, the bodies of a man and a woman. They had been shot to death, and the woman's throat was cut. Leaning against one of the man's shoes was his calling card, not as if it had fallen there, but as if it had been placed there. It bore the name Reverend Edward W. Hall. He had been the rector of the Protestant Episcopal Church of St. John the Evangelist in New Brunswick. The woman was identified as Mrs. Eleanor R. Mills, wife of the sexton of that church. Raymond Schneider and Pearl Balmer had stumbled upon what was to go down finally in the annals of our crime as perhaps the country's most remarkable mystery. Nobody was ever found guilty of the murders. Before the case was officially closed, 150 persons had had their day in court and on the front pages of the newspapers. The names of two must already have sprung to your mind. Mrs. Jane Gibson, called by the avid press the Pig Woman, and William Carpenter Stevens, once known to 100 million people simply as Willie. The Pig Woman died in 1931, but Willie Stevens went on living until his death in 1942 with his sister, Mrs. Hall, at 23 Nicole Avenue, New Brunswick. It was from that house that the Reverend Mr. Hall had walked at around 7:30 o'clock on the night of Thursday, the 14th of September, 1922, to his peculiar doom. With the activities in that house after Mr. Hall's departure, the state of New Jersey was to be vitally concerned. Number 23, Nicole Avenue, was to share with Daguerrotype's Lane, in which the bodies were found, the morbid interest of a whole nation 4 years later, when the case was finally brought to trial. What actually happened in Daguerrotype's Lane on the night of September 14th? What actually happened at 23 Nicole Avenue the same night? For the researcher, it is a matter of an involved and voluminous court record, colorful and exciting in places, confused and repetitious in others. Two things, however, stand out as sharply now as they did on the day of their telling. The Pig Woman's story of the people she saw in Daguerrotype's Lane that night, and Willie Stevens's story of what went on in the house in Nicole Avenue. Willie's story, brought out in cross-examination by a prosecutor whose name you may have forgotten, it was Alexander Simpson, lacked all the gaudy melodrama of the Pig Woman's tale, but in it, and in the way he told it on the stand, was the real drama of the Hall Mills trial. When the state failed miserably in its confident purpose of breaking Willie Stevens down, the verdict was already written on the wall. The rest of the trial was anticlimax. The jury that acquitted Willie and his sister, Mrs. Frances Stevens Hall, and his brother, Henry Stevens, was out only 5 hours. A detailed recital of all the fantastic events and circumstances of the Hall Mills case would fill a large volume. If the story is vague in your mind, it is partly because its edges, even under the harsh glare of investigation, remained curiously obscure and fuzzy. Everyone remembers, of course, that the minister was deeply involved with Mrs. Mills, who sang in his choir. Their affair had been for some time the gossip of their circle. He was 41. She was in her early 30s. Mrs. Hall was nearing 50. On the 14th of September, Mr. Hall had dinner at home with his wife, Willie Stevens, and a little niece of Mrs. Hall's. After dinner, he said, according to his wife and his brother-in-law, that he was going to call on Mrs. Mills. There was something about a payment on a doctor's bill. Mrs. Mills had had an operation, and the Halls had paid for it. Mrs. Hall had inherited considerable wealth from her parents. He left the house at about the same time it came out later that Mrs. Mills left her house, and the two were found murdered under a crabapple tree in Daguerrotype's Lane on the edge of town some 40 hours later. Around the bodies were scattered love letters, which the choir singer had written to the minister. No weapons were found, but there were several cartridge shells from an automatic pistol. The investigation that followed, marked, said one New Jersey lawyer, by bungling stupidity, resulted in the failure of the grand jury to indict anyone. Willie Stevens was questioned for hours, and so was Mrs. Hall. The pig woman told her extraordinary story of what she saw and heard in the lane that night, but she failed to impress the grand jurors. 4 years went by, and the Hall Mills case was almost forgotten by people outside of New Brunswick, when, in a New Jersey court, one Arthur Reel brought suit against his wife, the former Louise Geist, for annulment of their marriage. Louise Geist had been, at the time of the murders, a maid in the Hall household. Reel said in the course of his testimony that his wife had told him she knew all about the case, but had been given $5,000 to hold her tongue. This was all that Mr. Philip Payne, managing editor of the Daily Mirror, nosing around for a big scandal of some sort, needed. His newspaper played up the story until finally, under its goading, Governor Moore of New Jersey appointed Alexander Simpson special prosecutor with orders to reopen the case. Mrs. Hall and Willie Stevens were arrested, and so was their brother, Henry Stevens, and a cousin, Henry de la Bruyere Carpenter. At a preliminary hearing in Somerville, the pig woman, with eager stridency, told her story again. About 9 o'clock on the night of September 14th, she heard a wagon going along Hamilton Road near the farm on which she raised her pigs. Thieves had been stealing her corn, and she thought maybe they were at it again. So she saddled her mule, Jenny, soon to become the most famous quadruped in the country, and set off in grotesque pursuit. In the glare of an automobile's headlights in DeRussey's Lane, she saw a woman with white hair who was wearing a tan coat, and a man with a heavy mustache who looked like a colored man. These figures she identified as Mrs. Hall and Willie Stevens. Tying her mule to a cedar tree, she started toward the scene on foot and heard voices raised in quarrel. Somebody said something about letters. She now saw 3 persons. Later on, she increased this to 4, and a flashlight held by one of them illumined the face of a man she identified first as Henry Carpenter, later as Henry Stevens, and it glittered on something in the man's hand. Suddenly there was a shot, and as she turned and ran for her mule, there were 3 more shots. A woman's voice screamed, "Oh my, oh my, oh my," and the voice of another woman moaned, "Oh, Henry." The pig woman rode wildly home on her mule without investigating further, but she had lost one of her moccasins in her flight, and some 3 hours later, at 1 o'clock, she rode her mule back again to see if she could find it. This time, by the light of the moon, she saw Mrs. Hall, she said, kneeling in the lane, weeping. There was no one else there. The pig woman did not see any bodies. Mrs. Jane Gibson became, because of her remarkable story, the chief witness for the state, as Willie Stevens was to become the chief witness for the defense. If he and his sister were not in DeRussey's Lane, as the pig woman had shrilly insisted, it remained for them to tell the detailed story of their whereabouts and their actions that night, after Mr. Hall left the house. The grand jury this time indicted all 4 persons implicated by the pig woman, and the trial began on November 3rd, 1926. The first persons Alexander Simpson called to the stand were surprise witnesses. They were a Mr. and Mrs. John S. Dixon, who lived in North Plainfield, New Jersey, about 12 miles from New Brunswick. It soon became apparent that they were to form part of a net that Simpson was preparing to draw around Willie Stevens. They testified that at about 8:30 on the night of the murders, Willie had appeared at their house wearing a loose-fitting suit, a derby, a wing collar with bow tie, and across his vest a heavy gold chain to which was attached a gold watch. He had said that his sister had let him out there from her automobile and that he was trying to find the Parker Home for the Aged, which was at Bound Brook. He stuttered and told them that he was an epileptic. They directed him to a trolley car, and he went stumbling away. When Mrs. Dixon identified Willie as her visitor, she walked over to him and took his right hand and shook it vigorously, as if to wring recognition out of him. Willie stared at her, said nothing. When she returned to the stand, he grinned widely. That was one of many bizarre incidents which marked the progress of the famous murder trial. It deepened the mystery that hung about the strange figure of Willie Stevens. People could hardly wait for him to take the stand. William Carpenter Stevens had sat in court for 16 days before he was called to the witness chair on the 23rd of November, 1926. On that day, the trial of Albert B. Fall and Edward L. Doheny, defendants in the notorious Teapot Dome scandal, opened in Washington. But the nation had eyes only for a small, crowded courtroom in Somerville, New Jersey. Willie Stevens, after all these weeks, after all these years, was to speak out in public for the first time. As the New York Times said, he had been pictured as Crazy Willie, as a town character, as an oddity, as a butt for all manner of jokes. He had been compared inferentially to an animal, and the hint of an alien racial strain in his parentage had been thrown at him. Moreover, it had been prophesied that Willie would blow up on the stand, that he would be trapped into contradictions by the wily and crafty Alexander Simpson, that he would be tricked finally into blurting out his guilt. No wonder there was no sound in the courtroom except the heavy tread of Willie Stevens' feet as he walked briskly to the witness stand. Willie Stevens was an ungainly, rather lumpish man, about 5 feet 10 inches tall. Although he looked flabby, this was only because of his loose-fitting clothes and the way he wore them. Despite his 54 years, he was a man of great physical strength. He had a large head and a face that would be hard to forget. His head was covered with a thatch of thick, bushy hair, and his heavy black eyebrows seemed always to be arched, giving him an expression of perpetual surprise. This expression was strikingly accentuated by large, prominent eyes, which, seen through the thick lenses of the spectacles he always wore, seemed to bulge unnaturally. He had a heavy, drooping walrus mustache, and his complexion was dark. His glare was sudden and fierce. His smile, which came just as quickly, lighted up his whole face and gave him the wide, beaming look of an enormously pleased child. Born in Aiken, South Carolina, Willie Stevens had been brought to New Brunswick when he was 2 years old. When his wealthy parents died, a comfortable trust fund was left to Willie. The other children, Francis and Henry, had inherited their money directly. Once, when Mrs. Hall was asked if it was not true that Willie was regarded as essential to be taken care of in certain things, she replied, in certain aspects. The quality of Willie's mentality, the extent of his eccentricity, were matters the prosecution strove to establish on several occasions. Dr. Lawrence Runyon, called by the defense to testify that Willie was not an epileptic and had never stuttered, was cross-examined by Simpson. Said the doctor, "He may not be absolutely normal mentally, but he is able to take care of himself perfectly well. He is brighter than the average person, although he has never advanced as far in school learning as some others. He reads books that are above the average and makes a good many people look like fools." "A sort of genius in a way, I suppose," said Simpson, to which the doctor quietly replied, "Yes, that is just what I mean." There were all sorts of stories about Willie. One of them was that he had once started a fire in his backyard, and then, putting on a fireman's helmet, had doused it gleefully with a pail of water. It was known that for years he had spent most of every day at the firehouse of Engine Company No. 3 in Dennis Street, New Brunswick. He played cards with the firemen, ran errands for them, argued and joked with them, and was a general favorite. Sometimes he went out and bought a steak or a chicken, and it was prepared and eaten in the firehouse by the firemen and Willie. In the days when the Engine Company had been a volunteer organization, Willie was an honorary member, and always carried in the firemen's parades a flag he had bought and presented to the firehouse, an elaborate banner costing $60 or $70. He had also bought the black and white bunting with which the front of the firehouse was draped whenever a member of the company died. After his arrest, he had whiled away the time in his cell reading books on metallurgy. There was a story that when his sister-in-law, Mrs. Henry Stevens, once twitted him on his heavy reading, he said, "Oh, that is merely the bread and butter of my literary repast." The night before the trial opened, Willie's chief concern was about a new blue suit that had been ordered for him, and that did not fit him to his satisfaction. He had also lost a collar button, and that worried him. Mrs. Henry Stevens hurried to the jail before the court convened, and brought him another one, and he was happy. At the preliminary hearing weeks before, Simpson had declared with brutal directness that Willie Stevens did indeed look like a colored man, as the pig woman had said. At this, Willie had half risen from his chair and bared his teeth, as if about to leap on the prosecutor, but he had quickly subsided. For every adult in New Brunswick who had known his frown or his flare-up, there were a dozen children familiar only with his smile and his kindliness. To the younger ones he was a kind of magical, plain-clothes Santa Claus who could produce candy from his pocket like rabbits from a hat. He frequently bought clothing for poor children. The record does not show whether he gave them rides in his chauffeur-driven Buick. Willie liked to take long trips alone. Except for the fireman and a few cronies, he avoided adults, but he loved to talk about metallurgy with his intimates. After the trial, he took up botany and entomology, too. All through the trial, Willie Stevens had sat quietly, staring. He had been enormously interested when the pig woman, attended by a doctor and a nurse, was brought in to give her testimony. This was the man who, now on trial for his life, climbed into the witness chair in the courtroom at Somerville. There was an immense stir. Justice Charles W. Parker rapped with his gavel. Mrs. Hall's face was strained and white. This was an ordeal she and her family had been dreading for weeks. Willie's left hand gripped his chair tightly. His right hand held a yellow pencil with which he had fiddled all during the trial. He faced the room full of eyes tensely. His own lawyer, Senator Clarence E. Case, took the witness first. Willie started badly by understating his age 10 years. He said he was 44. "Isn't it 54?" asked Case. Willie gave the room his great beaming smile. "Yes," he chortled boyishly, as if amused by his slip. The spectators smiled. It didn't take Willie long to dispose of the Dixons, the couple who had sworn he stumbled into their house the night of the murder. He answered half a dozen questions on this point with strong emphasis, speaking slowly and clearly. He had never worn a derby. He had never had epilepsy. He had never stuttered. He had never had a gold watch and chain. Mr. Case held up Willie's old silver watch and chain for the jury to see. When he handed them back, Willie, with fine nonchalance, compared his watch with the clock on the courtroom wall, gave his sister a large, reassuring smile, and turned to his questioner with respectful attention. He described with technical accuracy an old revolver of his. The murders had been done with an automatic pistol, not a revolver, but a weapon of the same caliber as Willie's. He said he used to fire off the gun on the 4th of July. Remembering these old holidays, his eyes lighted up with childish glee. From this mood, he veered suddenly into indignation and anger. "When was the last time you saw the revolver?" was what set him off. "The last time I saw it was in this courthouse," Willie almost shouted. "I think it was in October 1922, when I was taken and put through a very severe grilling by, I cannot mention every person's name, but I remember Mr. Toulon, Mr. Lamb, and Detective David, and they did everything but strike me. They cursed me frightfully." The officers had got him into an automobile by a subterfuge, he charged. "Mr. David said he simply wanted me to go out in the country to ask me a very few questions, that I would not be very long." It transpired later that on this trip Willie himself had had a question to ask Detective David. Would the detective, if they passed DeRussey's Lane, be kind enough to point it out to him? Willie had never seen the place, he told the detective, in his life. He said that Mr. David showed him where it was. When Willie got to the night of September 14th, 1922, in his testimony, his anger and indignation were gone. He was placid, attentive, and courteous. He explained quietly that he had come home for supper that night, had gone to his room afterward, and remained in the house, leaving it at 2:30 in the morning with my sister. Before he went to bed, he said, he had closed his door to confine to his own room the odor of tobacco smoke from his pipe. "Who objected to that?" asked Mr. Case. Willie gave his sudden beaming grin. "Everybody," he said, and won the first of several general laughs from the courtroom. Then he told the story of what happened at 2:30 in the morning. It is necessary for a well-rounded picture of Willie Stevens to give it here at some length. "I was awakened by my sister knocking at my door," said Willie, "and I immediately rose and went to the door, and she said, 'I want you to come down to the church, as Edward has not come home. I am very much worried,' or words to that effect. I immediately got dressed and accompanied her down to the church. I went through the front door, followed a small path that led directly to the back of the house, past the cellar door. We went directly down Redmond Street to Jones Avenue. From Jones Avenue, we went to George Street. Turning into George Street, we went directly down to Commercial Avenue. There, our movements were blocked by an immense big freight automobile. We had to wait there maybe half a minute until it went by, going toward New York.